Hey everyone, I'm Amethyst, and if you watched my previous video, you may be experiencing some deja vu, as I just participated in a game jam a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, this game jam was one I was required to participate in, as it was run by my school. As a game design major, it is my duty to participate in school jams. Also, it's required for a grade. So without further ado, let's get started. Day 1. I received the theme Flow at 9 a.m. and began coming up with ideas. My goal was to create a short game similar to my first Godot game, made a little over a year ago. If you've played that game, you'll know that it's pretty short compared to my other games. Back then, I struggled a lot to finish that in time for the game jam I was participating in, but I've improved a lot since then, and I knew I would be able to make a similar game much quicker and easier. But that didn't really happen. It wasn't very long before I came up with the idea of time loops, inspired by the previous Brackeys Game Jam, where I played and rated a lot of games that dealt with time and resetting. The connection to the theme of flow is a bit iffy, but it's meant to be the flow of time and how it is disrupted in the game. From there, I employed my newfound character-driven strategy and created 2 characters. The designing of these characters was stagnant at first. I was drawing a blank for a while. But once I got started, I entered into a flow state, if you will. I made mood boards, backstories, personalities, etc. And once I was done with all of that, I gave them names, which took way too long. But I eventually settled on Ryan and Milo. Next was creating the sequence of events, which took around 3 hours, but I got it done. As always, this step was quite exhausting. I designed 4 different loops that are meant to take place throughout the story. And from that, I created 2 endings, which later became 3 endings. The goal was to have certain actions performed by the player lead to different endings. Once I was done with all the planning, the next thing I did, surprisingly, was start on the in-engine work as opposed to creating any art. Since I didn't want to be spending the whole game jam creating all the mechanics, I thought it would be better to create everything I needed first and then go into the game. A few months ago, I had taken my dialogue system from my game Hollowed and spent some time refining it and adding comments and such. So I took that system and added it into my project for this game. Then I spent some time testing and tweaking it. And since I knew there would likely be things the player would have to pick up, I also created an extension to the dialogue system that allows for picking up items. Luckily, that didn't take too long. After all, there was no need for a full-on inventory system. Next, I went into Dialogic, which is the add-on I use to add all the dialogue in the game. It's also what my dialogue system is built around. Most of it is built outside of Dialogic, meaning I never actually went inside the code that makes up the add-on. But for another mechanic I had in mind for this game, I would have to. My idea for this time loop game was to have a system similar to the kindergarten games. If you haven't heard of these games, they're basically puzzle adventure games that take place throughout a day of kindergarten. Each part of the day is given a certain number of actions that the player can perform before the game moves on to the next part of the day. Doing things like talking to the different characters does not take up any actions, but doing things like picking up objects, giving items to characters, or going into different areas uses up actions. So I basically wanted to create a system like that. In order to do this, I needed to somehow show in the game that a choice was a special choice that would use up an action. Kindergarten does this by displaying an icon next to important choices, and I was aiming to do something similar, but in order to do that, I had to go into Dialogic's code for the choices and modify that. In theory, it should be simple. I'm just changing the look of a button, right? Wrong. The complexity comes with making only the special choices have that icon. So that means I have to somehow tell Dialogic that the choice is a special choice, get that choice to show the icon, and then trigger another program if the player chooses that choice. I struggled a lot with this and tried many different ways to make this happen, but on day 1 I wasn't able to and decided to try again the next day. For the remainder of the day, however, I moved on to another part of the kindergarten-like action system, which is the part that displays how many actions the player has. This was much easier to figure out. The visuals are very simple. I just picked a placeholder image and positioned it in the bottom left of the screen in an HBox container. That just puts all its children in a row where each item is perfectly spaced apart. As for the functionality, here's the code. First, I created code that adds more actions to the visual portion depending on how many actions are specified. This is done by duplicating this image that's already in the container X amount of times. After that, I created the functionality for when an action needs to be removed. Since the dialogue part of the system wasn't working at the time, I just made a hotkey to allow me to test it. And I also added into the code what happens when the player runs out of actions. Basically, it just resets the current scene. Later, I had to add more code to determine whether to reset the scene or move to the next scene. I admit the code for this is not the best, but I added it later in the jam, so I was tired by then. And when I'm tired, my code gets lazy. Day 2. Funnily enough, I fixed the choice issue almost immediately on day 2. Here's the code for it. Don't ask how exactly I figured it out because I'm not entirely sure myself. I'm just glad it works with no issues. Once that was done, I quickly connected it up with the UI so that choosing an action in dialogue decreases the number of actions the player has. But other than that, my goal for day 2 was to get as much necessary art done as possible, starting with designing Ryan. For Ryan, I wanted him to give off this very cool vibe. I also wanted him to be half Japanese. I'm not sure why, as it doesn't really affect the story. It's just a fun fact, I guess. Most of the design was just focused on making him look like a cool guy in his senior year of high school. I'm not too great at depicting specific ages, so if he doesn't look like he's around 18, sorry about that. I also gave him a ponytail because I think it looks cool. And then also jewelry because he's artistic, and it also makes him look cool. Since Ryan and Milo have a connection to each other that I can't specify for spoiler reasons, I made their designs opposite when it comes to color. So Ryan's color scheme is dark and red, and Milo's is light and blue. I know red and blue aren't actually complementary colors, but on my color wheel they are. I also added a bit of the other character's color to each design. So Ryan has a small bit of blue on his design, and Milo has a small bit of red in his design. It's storytelling, but through color. A little bit of yin and yang, if you will. I'm usually not that thoughtful when it comes to color choices, but I wanted to try it out. After Ryan was Milo. His design was a struggle. I don't draw men a lot, so the anatomy is somewhat difficult for me. The idea was to make Milo look scrawny and kind of pathetic. But I didn't know how to do that without having his head too big on his body. But making his head smaller somehow made him look too broad or muscular. You can see that I at first drew his body in a front-facing perspective, but I really hated pretty much everything about it. I tried my best to make it work, but I eventually just completely redrew the body angled slightly to the side. I liked that much better. I also redrew the face a few times. Next were his clothes, which were also a hassle. Like Ryan, I was hoping to design him some normal clothes. Normal as in clothes you might see anyone wear on a day-to-day basis. But also, since Milo is a bit on the magical side, I didn't want to lean too far into normal. But I couldn't give him anything too cool to wear, of course. I eventually landed on some normal clothes with the addition of a cape. I know capes can be cool, but imagine that Milo wears it so that he can look cool. For the colors, as I mentioned earlier, his colors are mostly blue with hints of red. I also gave him red eyes. I then gave him really pale skin and red under his eyes to hopefully convey that he's on the weaker side, maybe even a little sickly. And then freckles, because that makes him look cuter. The rest of the day was spent making one of the only tile sets needed for the game and any other extra individual assets. Day 3. On day 3, before I got into the actual game, I made Ryan's sprite sheet and added that and all the other art into the game. Then I set to work on the intro and first loop of the game. The intro was easy as it was just a black screen with text coming in and out. The idea is relatively simple, but I had never done it before, so I had to learn. Luckily, no complicated code was needed to have a typing effect with normal Godot text. There is already a parameter in the inspector called visible ratio that can be used to change the amount of text displayed. Using this, I was quite easily able to animate the intro to have all the text I needed. I also added a way to skip the intro. I did this by adding code that jumps to the next scene if the player presses the right key. On that same note, I created a hotkey that allows the player and myself to quickly skip through dialogue. Not only is this useful for me as I'm making and testing the game, but it's also useful for players playing the game multiple times. This also required me to go into some dialogic code, but it was much easier to figure out. Next was loop 1. Each loop has a certain amount in order of actions that must be performed to progress. If you complete those actions, the next time the loop is reset, it will move on to the next progression. In-game, it looks more or less the same, but you technically go to a different place, in a sense. So I created the necessary actions to be performed for this loop. That, in and of itself, was relatively quick. After that loop was technically done. Next was the fun part, adding in all the extra witty dialogue. With all my previous Game Jam entries, I've wanted to add in extra things you can interact with and extra quests that have nothing to do with the main story but are fun. However, I never had the time to do that before. But this jam was going to be different, so that's exactly what I did. And it took quite a while. It's pretty hard to come up with unique or witty dialogue for something like a couch. But I think I succeeded, somewhat. Afterward, I took a break to draw some more. I created CGs for the door, the paper, the window, and the fridge, and I started on one for the couch. Not necessary, but I think it was a nice touch. Day 4. Day 4 was the time to work on the second iteration of the loop. The great thing about this idea is that I can just reuse the same layout and map over and over and over again. Though loop 2 is quite different from loop 1 and can be separated into 3 parts. The beginning part, the scary part, and the aftermath part. The first part was fairly straightforward. The process was basically the same as loop 1, but the second part was completely different. This part has no actions and instead requires the player to walk around and turn on X amount of lights to move on to the final part of loop 2. So first, I duplicated one of the previous scenes and got rid of all the interaction objects. And then I couldn't really proceed forward before making some extra art, so I quite literally went back to the drawing board and drew up Milo's sprite sheet. Back to Godot, the first thing I did was create chasing AI for Milo. Yep, that's right, Milo chases the player in this part. Creating AI like this isn't necessarily new for me. At least 3 of my games before this have some kind of NPC or enemy that follows the player. So most of my code for this is the same as before, with some slight modifications. For one thing, Milo does not have to navigate around anything. Lore-wise, it makes sense for him to be able to go through walls and such. It also makes it much easier for me to set up. Also, I put Milo on a timer. First, he waits until the current dialogue is finished, then he waits about 6 seconds before giving chase. And when he catches you, he forces you to start all over again. So that was the fail state done. Next was the win state. Like I said, that is done by turning on X amount of lights, all before Milo catches you. The creation of the light bulbs was fairly simple. They are basically pickups that change how they look instead of being picked up, so making that was simple. And after that exhilarating experience, the player is sent to the aftermath portion of loop 2, which is just some dialogue. As you can probably imagine, this was all quite a lot. So I didn't really have any time to add any extra dialogue on that day. Days 5 and 6. I began with creating the third loop. This loop is like the in-between between loop 1 and loop 2. The complexity is more like loop 1, but the mechanics are more like loop 2. Aside from some dialogue, the player has to go around and destroy various items to progress. The only real change from the functionality of the light bulbs was to make it so that the destroyable objects don't appear and can't be interacted with before the time they're supposed to. And then I also had to change the map visually. That included creating an altered, glitched version of the original tileset. Then I added alternate versions of the map into the loop that vary in how destroyed they are. The final loop of the game was next, and that one was by far the easiest because it's the ending loop, meaning it leads to the endings. So 90% of the work was just writing. The remaining 10% mostly had to do with the visuals. After that, I made some additional illustrated graphics for both the endings and some other parts of the game. Unfortunately, I couldn't finish either of the ending artworks on these days like I had planned. I also added a little code and did a little extra work with the tile map in some of the artworks so I could animate them with a glitching effect. I think it looks really cool. And once I was done with all that necessary stuff, I could finally move on to the unnecessary stuff, like polishing and adding extra dialogue. So I went back through all the loops and added special dialogue to all of the various interactables. It took many, many hours and was quite exhausting, but I got it done, thankfully. I also added little text animations that play at the end and tell you what ending you got, typing sounds to those little animations, and a loading screen. I usually add loading screens to all my games, but this one was a little different because I actually added graphics to it. I made my own custom spinning clock animation for it, which I thought was a nice touch. Days 7, 8, and 9. I decided to combine these days because they mostly consist of polishing and bug fixing. The first thing I did was create a basic title screen with a credit section, as I was required for this game jam to add a credit screen. I came up with the title Broken Flow, though I don't really like it. Then I found the main music that would be playing on loop throughout the title screen and most of the game. From that, I played through and playtested the entire game so that I could write down a list of things I wanted to add or change. It was a very long list. I had my work cut out for me. Both my brothers also playtested the game, so I ended up adding more to the list from that. Unfortunately, as one of them was playtesting, he ran into two major game-breaking bugs. One where the dialogue fails to show up and the player can't move anymore. Another where the game crashes when a loop resets. Both bugs, at the time, seemed random with no clear cause. I spent a very long time working on both, but couldn't fix either at the time. I was quite overwhelmed at this point, so I decided to move away from bug fixing and work on some of the easier, faster little fixes. There are a lot of these, so I won't go into every one. But here's a list if you're curious. Regarding larger bugs, I fixed these bugs. Again, it's a bit long, so I'll just show a list. Since there are so many different things the player can do, there are a lot of things that need to be accounted for, which is what caused a lot of these bugs and issues to occur, I think. Regarding art, I finished up and added in both the ending CGs and some miscellaneous art for the title screen, the itch.io page, and some other things. Additionally, I added a gallery to the game that the player can unlock after finishing the game once. I've wanted to add galleries to my games for a while now, but I either didn't have the skills to do it, or I didn't have time. This time I had both, as well as some extra incentive that I will talk about in a bit. Then I playtested the game a few more times. Unfortunately, at the beginning of my first playthrough, I ran into a pretty big bug that renders the game unplayable. The bug was caused by a minor change that I had made earlier to the actions code and had to do with the game resetting incorrectly. I kid you not when I say it took me 3 hours to fix this thing. 3 hours of pain, suffering, blood, sweat, and tears. It was around 8 p.m. by the time it was done, and I still had a lot of playtesting to get through. The good news is that I did manage to figure out the cause of that weird dialogue bug that causes the player to freeze in place. I was able to fix that in about 5 minutes after successfully recreating it several times. Thank goodness. I also added an extra hotkey that the player can use to force a time loop to reset, just in case they got stuck. But other than that, most of the rest of the playtesting was successful and had no bugs. And after exporting the game to itch.io, I was done. Finally. This game was a lot, and I really thought it would be easier and more relaxing than my previous Game Jam games. I was sorely mistaken, but I was really glad that I was done. Unfortunately, I could not fix that one crashing bug, but I tried my absolute best to do so. It just so happens to be the kind of bug that isn't easily recreatable, and that makes it all the harder to fix. I did try to implement a fix, but it didn't end up working. I personally did not encounter the bug while playtesting, but the judge of the Game Jam most certainly did. Twice. Luckily for me, Broken Flow managed to get first place in the Game Jam. I was quite literally shaking when I heard the news. This is the first time I have ever gotten first place in a Game Jam, and I'm surprised considering the game crashed on the judge twice. But I am very proud of myself nonetheless. It would mean a lot to me if you checked out the game. Just like most of my previous games, it's free to play and playable on browser. But if that doesn't work, there's also a downloadable build available for Windows. I apologize if you encounter the game crashing bug. Now that the game jam is officially over, I plan to upload a post-jam bug update that will hopefully fix that. I'm not sure if that update will be up by the time this video comes out, but if it is, please let me know if you still run into that bug. Also, there are quite a few Easter eggs in the game. This game jam took place around one of my brother's birthdays, and he happens to love Among Us. So in honor of that, there are about 17 Among Us Easter eggs in the game. 15 of them are hidden in various artworks that you can view in the gallery if you miss them. One is a cutscene that can be found by exploring, and the last one is hidden somewhere on the map. Can you find them all? But anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already to see more of this kind of content. Take care and farewell.